Hey guys, welcome to Coast Connection, Embrace the Power. I have Ann Moss Rogers on today, and we're going to talk about a difficult subject, and it's about suicide. However, we're going to talk about how you grow from that, how do we learn from that, and how do we generally make the world a better place. So, Ann Moss, welcome to Coastal Connection. How are you doing?
Well, thank you. I appreciate you tackling a really difficult subject and one that is, I'm very passionate about.
Oh, absolutely. So before we get started, kind of give the audience a little background on what you were doing before the police knocked on your door, what kind of job you were doing, what kind of life you had, because your life has evolved and you went on a different journey since that dreadful day. So if you can give us a little background, that give us a little context before we go any further. Thank you.
Sure. So about 2010, my youngest son, Charles Aubrey Rogers, who was the funniest, most popular kid in school, started misusing substances, and we didn't know why. And we kept, doing things like drug testing, taking away the car keys, and all the things you think about doing. And I realized that wasn't slowing him down. And I was trying also at the same time to get a diagnosis of maybe there was some kind of mental health condition underlying all of his substance misuse.
Yes.
Well, I didn't end up getting that diagnosis locally despite asking for it. So we kidnapped our son out of his bed and we took him to a wilderness program. And you don't do that because you've caught your kid with a beer and a joint. You do that because you think your child's life is truly at risk. And of course, he didn't love that step, and it wasn't plan A. And all this time, he was actually using drugs and alcohol to numb feelings of thoughts of suicide. Because to him, if we numb them and push them away, then they'll go away. And what really happens is when, it comes back like a boomerang on steroids.
Wow.
And he didn't recognize that that wasn't, a healthy coping strategy because he's a teen and it worked right now in the moment. But of course, long term, that doesn't work in your favor because then you have two really big issues to deal with. And it was, he ended up going to this wilderness program to therapeutic boarding school. He came back in 2014, having spent some 22 months outside our home in some kind of placement. He graduated high school, which we were thrilled about. But what I didn't know is that he wasn't using any of the new coping strategies he'd learned while he was away. So he went back to what he had originally been using, was drugs and alcohol. And a lot of that had to do with the stigma and also the way the mental health system treats patients,
Right.
they kind of shame them. So he's like, well, I have a better solution than this, and I don't need to be shamed.
I understand.
So he went back to using drugs and alcohol, becomes addicted to heroin. And unbeknownst to us, he became addicted to heroin. And we knew 30 days before he actually ended up dying. And he goes to rehab, a detox in rehab, and he relapsed at the recovery house.
Wow.
And I thought, okay, all they have to do is take him back to detox for 3 days. He can go back to the recovery house and we get back on track. I was ready for recovery, but my son was not. And so he left detox with a friend and he never found his way back. And then it was just a couple of weeks later that we met the police in the parking lot. They were actually at our home and they called my husband's cell phone, and we met them in the parking lot, and they delivered the news that our son had been found dead. And once we took a break from all the wailing and screaming and crying, my husband asked, how did he die? And I remember thinking that was a crazy question because I was sure he was going to say overdose, but that's not how he died. And my husband said, well, how did he die? And the policeman said it was a suicide. And the method left no question. And I just couldn't imagine that I would be such a lousy mother that my child would check out on me, or that his life was so bad that he would suicide. But a lot of that has to do with I didn't understand at that point what suicide was, what it meant, or the despair that people felt when they were in that emotional crisis. And a lot of people think of it as a choice.
Right.
And it's really not a choice, but something people are driven to in a moment of extreme emotional or physical pain, or both. And that has really helped me understand. So I sold the digital marketing business and decided to do this full time. And I'm a suicide prevention trainer, and I'm also a keynote speaker. And I am speaking to a military group in January about this subject, and speak to a lot of educators because of the book that Kim O'Brien and I wrote.
Right.
So I guess I've become something of an expert, and probably one of the things that I do that few other in the world do is that I recognize how many people search online for ways to die. And I've devised a way to capture those searches and be a person that answers those cries for help when people come to a page wondering how to kill themselves and instead post a comment or want to tell their story. And I want them to know that, and I want them to feel heard. Because, Vince, that is probably the greatest gift we can offer another human being.
Oh no, absolutely. And I know social economic status doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you are well off or bad or poor. Mental health is a social problem, and COVID hasn't helped that. So I realize now and more and so that as our society, we are coping with a lot of things that we haven't really had to cope with as a society. And a lot of people have been put in situations they financially weren't in before COVID, and now their life is totally changed and upside down. And sometimes they see their self-worth not there. You know, you did a great job. I read through your book, Emotionally Naked. And I appreciate the way you exposed yourself and how you went through the process. Could you tell us a little bit about you becoming an author and trying to make sure you bring critical words out, then so that we get rid of the stigma and start dealing with the problems?
So I guess after my son died and I was struggling, and I would run into people and they would cut me off mid-sentence when I would start to talk about my child. And Vince, that made me mad. I was like, you know, he was part of my life. And just because he died by suicide doesn't mean I don't want to talk about him. Right. And I wasn't ashamed of him. And so I wrote a newspaper article about my family story, and I can't say that everyone loved it. But the people who read it did, and it went viral.
It did.
This little tiny article of this newspaper just like went all over the world, and it had thousands and thousands of comments. And what it was is other people were reading their story in mine. They had a child who struggled with substance use disorder or mental illness or both, or they had a family member who died by suicide. I decided we needed to talk about it. And what's really funny is I'll go to a presentation and I'll start talking about it. And then people come up and they want to kind of get me off to the side and tell me their story. They don't want anybody else to hear it. And they want to whisper it. And that's so ironic to me because I've just been on stage, you know, telling our story. But it's a process.
It is.
And many times that's the first time anybody's ever talked about it. And if they make that first step, then they can start to feel empowered to tell that story without being ashamed of their loved one, because their loved one struggled with maybe substance use disorder, maybe a mental health condition, maybe a traumatic event. Because nobody dies by suicide because they're getting a divorce. That can be a trigger or a last straw, but there are multiple other reasons that have been going on in this person's life, like you mentioned a minute ago. A change in financial status, a wife that leaves, maybe at the same time they've gotten a diagnosis, or they've been demoted at work. So it's kind of this perfect storm that creates this vulnerable situation. And if the person doesn't really have a toolbox of really good coping strategies or feel that they can reach out, sometimes they will take their life because they have the means to do so. And so we need to start recognizing those invitations and start listening to people more, not fixing it. Because when we listen to people who are suicidal, we need to listen and say things like, tell me more. How long have you felt this way? I'm so sorry you feel this way. Meet them where they are in their pain, instead of, you have so much to live for. Oh, we're so tempted to fix it and say things like that, because that's how we see them, right? You know?
Right. You know, but, I'm sorry.
But that's not the space they're in at that moment.
Oh, yeah. And I often think that, you know, everybody thinks there's a quick fix to everything, because we live in such a society in our society that everything has a quick fix, and there's a process. And I don't think a lot of people understand that there is a massive process when you're dealing with mental illness, and it's not something that you can switch a light on or turn it off and everybody's going to be happy and okay. You know, I'm sure Charles was vibrant, had a great life, and you know, and you just didn't see any of this coming, and when it happened, it's a joke, because, you know, as I told you earlier before we started, you know, I had a half brother. He made the same decision, and I don't think anybody's prepared to deal with it. But you said some key things, and you also talked about your process in your book of how you process going through things, is that you actually have to live it. Then you write about it, and you have emotional breakdowns, and you pick yourself back up, and you keep moving forward. And so as you went through that process, you started helping other people. And so it wasn't no longer just you anymore. You became, and the word advocate's not an advocate. The word is, you actually became a person people turn to. So can you kind of tell us the fact that you went from this grieving mother, to now you're helping people that are struggling with their own addictions and their own thoughts of mental illness. And now you're that person that people actually reach out to and talk to. How does that impact you? I mean, because it's got to be, whew.
I know it did evolve there. So I wrote the article, and then the book had been writing itself in my head before my son died, except of course, in my little fantasy, he was going to be a recovery star. And I was going to write about that later. And I couldn't wait to write that book. So after he died, that book reformed in my head. And so the article goes viral. I started the blog called Emotionally Naked and started to write basically publicly how I felt. And boy, putting those posts out there pretty much made me cringe. And I thought, I'm begging for attention. That's what it felt like. But something was driving me to keep sharing.
Right.
And then somebody said, well, I want to subscribe. And then more people. And now I have like close to 10,000 subscribers.
You do.
And I'm like,
you have a following. You do have a following. And it's a positive thing, Ann Moss. It's a positive thing.
It is. It is. And that kind of drove me to share more. So they supported me in this effort. And without them, I'm not sure I would have kept sharing.
Right.
So I published the first book, Diary of a Broken Mind, which is a memoir. And I included my son's lyrics in that book about every other chapter. So you can read the story from my perspective and his perspective, so that you get what he was thinking and what I was thinking, which at times was very different. And I think that perspective, that's the feedback I get from parents. So I'm marketing that book, I'm blogging, and then we're right before the pandemic and we're hearing about things this January, and Wiley Publishing reaches out to me and says, do you want to write a book for teachers? And we were thinking about Emotionally Naked, a teacher's guide to preventing suicide and recognizing students at risk. And I was like, oh, sure, I'd be glad to write that book. And then I hung up and I panicked.
Why did you panic?
Because I'm like, how am I going to do this? You know, they haven't accepted me in the suicide prevention space.
Right.
Yet, you know, I'm not a PhD, I'm not a teacher, I'm not, but you know what? I have lived experience, and I went and found a PhD to be a co-writer with. And what I didn't recognize, Vince, is how much data I had of my own from my website and from the Google Drive and from my statistics. And I have a ton of data and I have a ton of comments. So I am reaching people when they are feeling the absolute worst in their life. They're not reflecting back. They are in that moment when I am replying to them. And that's very different, because I think a therapist is often sitting with a patient and they may feel, oh, it was yesterday or a few hours ago, but it's in the moment for me, and I had to figure out how to answer.
Right.
So I'm writing the book, and during the pandemic, I'm answering like so many more comments than I ever have. But what I kept finding out is that in this vast and uncaring world, just hearing one person respond and say, I hear you, I'm listening, keep talking, has a profound effect on people. And that was a gift I could keep pushing forward in my son's name, because that's what he did so well. And I didn't really recognize that I was doing what Charles had been doing, and I was carrying that forward, and that was part of my healing and surviving.
Well, I mean, you're representing Charles well, and the thing is that you are reaching out and touching so many people, because I realize, looking at your stuff on Twitter, looking at your homepage for your website, watching your TED Talk, which that's unbelievable on your TED Talk. How did you get to the point where you have arrived? You're giving a TED Talk and you're talking about a tough subject with people, but I love the way you delivered it. So just tell me, how did that feel? That's you on the stage putting that power out there.
Oh, I wanted to do a TED Talk for so long. And I applied twice and I was turned down twice. And I thought, this is just never going to happen. And then I got invited, and it was to a TED event where you couldn't apply for it. It was invitation only.
Wow.
And I was given 6 minutes to deliver what was kind of a complicated, content marketing and search engine optimization are not common terms to people.
No.
So I had to boil it down to what people understood quickly. And I remember, practicing it. And once I got there and looking at that big red dot and feeling very nervous, and suddenly taking a deep breath, going, the nerves and the excitement are this close together. This is what I wanted, and I
Right.
can't wait to get out there. And my audience embraced me and supported me. And I did my 6 minutes, and everybody came up afterwards and said, it was too short. I wanted more of you.
Ex-
And that just felt so good. And, it's not like the most watched TED Talk, but I will say that when somebody is considering me for a speaking engagement, what they tell me is that, I am emotionally naked. I'm not
Right.
looking for perfectly polished, but I'm looking for somebody to make it real, for my audience to feel something, and not just sadness,
Right.
but I want them to laugh. I want them to cry, and I want them to leave with a message of hope. And so that's really, really important to me, that they feel that sense of hope, that even though I've suffered the most devastating loss of my life,
Right.
that they leave with, okay, how can you turn this tragedy into purpose? How can you turn this into a potential for healing and building your emotional toolbox for coping? Which is basically what I've done. And I've even gone back to coping strategies I used in my grief journey and recognized what ones fit with dialectical behavioral therapy. And I start breaking it down and then writing down what the example is so they can see how I applied it. And I didn't even know those existed.
Wow.
But what would happen if more people knew they existed? And they
Right.
can use these healthy coping strategies. And the point is to build a lot of them. So writing was a big one for me. Exercising was a big one for me. Going out in the cold was a big one for me. Going to a support group and opening up and bonding with other people who had been through this tragedy. All those things helped. And, so it's not just one thing. You've got to have several things, and then other people have shared that they liked reading a book of fart jokes. They liked beekeeping, gardening, and then other people say painting or some other creative pursuit. It's been really interesting what people have identified as their coping strategies, and I
Right.
just love that.
So, when you're looking at coping strategies, if you had to give some people that advice, because I think a lot of people, when they deal with a tragedy, that very few of them ever kind of step back and do a reflection and then go through the process. I mean, I see people that my wife she had a miscarriage. She went through a process, and it
Oh,
took her a while. And back in it was when we first got married, and so, I watched that process, and it tells me that there is emotional steps that everyone has to go through when they go through a tragedy. And so, if you had to give advice to someone out there that watched this, what would some of the advice you would give them?
feel the feelings, because you can't heal if you can't feel. And I'll tell you, those really, really intense and the most painful feelings will last 60 to 90 seconds. Now, you may feel pretty raunchy the whole day, but the really, really intense, take you to your knees kind of pain, 60 to 90 seconds. It might hit every 15 minutes at first when it's really raw, but you just tell yourself you will survive. It won't always be that intense. And those little episodes, and the whole thing is that the purpose of healing is actually the building blocks. All that pain are the building blocks to emotional healing. So that pain does have a purpose,
Right.
and it does help you build resilience. So, and people probably minimized your wife's miscarriage. Oh, I had one of those. But I mean, it's a profound loss, not to everyone, but it is to a lot of people. to most people. I mean, you've carried this life, you had these expectations, and all of a sudden life it kind of
Yeah.
blows up in your face. What do
Right.
you do? How do you manage this? So feel your feelings, because everybody wants to kind of push away their feelings. And it's so important not to do that. And if you go to drugs and alcohol to numb them, then you're going to stay stuck
Right.
in that raw state. And I didn't want to be stuck. So I actually said, I'm not drinking anymore, because that's a slippery slope. It didn't work for my son. And I found that I was able to move through that journey in a more productive way by doing that. And that was a personal choice.
No, that's a great choice. I mean, anytime you're dealing with a tragedy or anything that you're dealing with any kind of loss, I truly believe this. Even soldiers, and I'm glad you brought up the subject about soldiers, because I'm a retired Army guy,
Yeah.
and soldiers have been dealing with a lot since coming out of combat, and often they use alcohol as a substitute instead of getting the right therapy. And I realize, like I've told several people that I've known over the years, is that it's a journey for you to get through what you got through, because I have friends that lost friends while we were overseas. And so it's a lot to deal with and take in. But like I tell them, is that you can use alcohol as an instrument, but it's the non-preferred instrument. What you really need to do is just go ahead and deal with your issue, get help, which is, I think, is my biggest struggle. And if you could give any advice on that, because a lot of people have stigmas about if you say, hey, you know what, I actually need to get some help, some professional help. And then, the stigmas our society has over the last 20 years, prior to we really started addressing mental health, was like, oh, something's wrong with you if you have to go get help, you're weak,
Oh, I think I was listening to a new type of intervention with the military. So there are two things here. Is one, if somebody is struggling, just pull out an index card and write down reasons for living. And if you can't think of that right away, that's okay. On the other side of that index card, write out who you would reach out to or feel that you could speak to in a moment of crisis, or even leading up to a crisis. Let's say you're going through a divorce. I mean, that's crushing blow.
Right.
Who could you talk to so that you can avoid getting to crisis? So on this index card, you go one side, what are the things that give your life purpose and meaning? Is it a dog? Is it your family? And on the other side, who you'd reach out to and their phone numbers.
Right.
The second thing is to think about means safety. And what I mean by that is that we lose a lot of veterans and active duty service members because they have access to firearms. And firearms are highly lethal ways to die by suicide. And 65% of all deaths by firearm are suicides. They're not homicides, they're not home invasions.
No, you're absolutely right.
So how can we support each other, especially service members, when we see that they are in emotional crisis? Maybe we say, well, I tell you what, you keep your weapon, but maybe for right now, you give me your firing pin.
Right.
Until this is all blown over. So you want to address that means safety, but even before, you say get help. And then figure out, okay, they're not going to do that. Maybe they'll put it in a biometric safe. Maybe they'll put pictures of their loved ones. As soon as they open the box, they see members of their family on top of their firearm. Maybe that would make them hesitate.
Right.
Maybe that friend could lock it in the trunk of their car temporarily. So figure out between the two friends what that person is willing to do to remove the means, because what happens is when you're in that moment of suicidality, you're going to grab to the thing that's going to make that pain stop.
Right.
5 minutes later, that person would make a completely different decision. And you'd say, are you thinking of suicide? I'm like, no way, I'd never do that.
Right.
That's how quickly that feeling can dissipate. And we want to make sure that we're listening to what our buddies say. And if you feel in your gut, they're saying things like, I can't do this anymore. I'm worthless. I'm not going on anymore. Or they start ghosting or isolating, giving away precious possessions, or putting things on social media like, if I died,
Yes.
no one would
You
notice.
care. Right.
No one would care. You're going to get a feeling in your gut that's like, oh, I'm not qualified. Well, you are qualified. If you are able to listen, you are qualified. And you need to ask that buddy and engage in a conversation. And then you want to listen and then eventually see if they will connect to help. And if they are not willing to connect to help, you got to tell somebody.
Yes.
Because this is life or death. And this is, they, a year from now, they may not feel this way at all. But it's really important that we act and we work through that fear, because we're always going to feel that sense of fear. So 2 veterans, a friend of mine, they went out to lunch and the 2 guys were talking, and my friend Bill was talking to his friend, and let's call the other guy Sam.
Okay.
And he said, I'm thinking of suicide. And he said, well, how are you going to do it? And he wasn't going to use a firearm. He was going to use a different method. And he told Bill what he was going to do. And he goes, we're not going to get lunch right now. Because what we're going to do is we're going to go to your barn and dismantle what you just told me you rigged up there. Is that okay with you? And they both went together, and they're having a conversation about football and who's winning, and they're dismantling all this rope and stuff that he had,
put together.
Yeah, put together. And then he says, if you feel like this again, put me on your call list. But I may be asleep, so we're going to put in the crisis text line and the veterans suicide and lifeline. And so start building your network of people to call. And this was 2 friends, and this Bill said, I've been where you've been, Sam. I get it. And it was kind of like, and I mean, they're pulling all this down. And he said, yeah, we're just talking about the football teams and all that. And I mean, just gotta talk.
Battle buddy.
It's just another day. I mean, how many people in the military haven't thought about that at some point? I mean, think about all the things you see and do, Vince. I mean,
there's some hard days. There were some hard days, trust me, and there are a lot of things you had to cope. And I will put it out there. I sought help after I came back from my second tour of Iraq, and it was reason why it is just that the mental drain on any human being will cause anybody to maybe have to talk to somebody. And you know what?
Absolutely.
And getting help doesn't make you weak. It actually makes you stronger, because everybody, to me, everyone has an opportunity to change lives for other people out there. And if you're gone, somebody misses an opportunity that they would have had if they had got a chance to meet you. So that's my take on life, and then my take when I have to talk to soldiers who are struggling with any addictions or just any human being. Because I teach school, and I've already dealt with that once already as a school teacher of a student making a bad decision and a permanent decision. And you walk yourself as a teacher every day. Was there anything I could have done different? Is there anything that I could have seen? And I realized there was nothing, because there was no sign for me.
Right.
So
it's hard to see the signs if you've not seen them. It's funny because I didn't see them before, but now they're just like giant red stop signs to me now. I see them. But what I love, what you said a minute ago, Vince, is that you said, I went and got help and I talked to somebody. It doesn't mean that you have to go to a therapist for 10 years. It doesn't mean you have to take medication for the rest of your life. That may be advisable, but it may not be. It may just be a period of time. Everyone has struggles. Everyone has struggles at some point. And when you are connecting with another human being, you're also helping them. So everybody comes to me and says, oh, you're helping me so much. And it's like, I want you to know that by my helping you, I'm also helping myself, because it makes me feel good to be able to help you. So you're doing something for me too.
Okay.
And I think that men sometimes need to hear that.
They do. They do. We need it more than people realize.
Oh, yeah. Well, think about our society and how men, and the military isn't all men, but you know, it's
majority
predominantly males. Our society is not set up in a way that allows men to really express themselves. So we need to be there for each other. I mean, the men need to be there for each other, and they need not to be afraid to step forward and share something about themselves with their friend if they want that person to open up.
Oh, yes. And so, Ann Moss, well, we run out of time, but guess what? You have more than 6 minutes. And you,
wow.
Yeah, you have more than 6 minutes. And you know what? It was it's the impact that you make, and you're making an impact just not in America. You're making an impact internationally, because I see the amount of people that just kind of follow you and are resonating with you. So I appreciate you coming on Coastal Connection. I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me about a tough subject, but it's a subject that we got to keep conquering. And as I always ask people before you leave, the last word, if you leave any imprint of for your history on this earth, what would it be?
Just listen. Really, don't try to fix. Really, really sit down and listen to another human being and let them know that you're sitting with them in their pain.
Awesome. So thank you so much, Ann Moss. Many hugs to you. Happy holiday season, and hopefully a happy new year. And we'll talk to you soon, because you know what? I'm definitely, when we do a military get together veterans podcast, we definitely want to have you on there when we have all those leaders on there talking about tough subjects. So you're being invited already.
All right, I would love that.
And it's in November, so you're being invited already. And with that being
okay,
said,
well, that's way in advance.
That's right.
I'm
so
going to hold you to it.
I'm going to hold you to it. And
okay.
So, guys, as we always say to every guest that comes on here, keep rolling and keep doing great things and aspire to inspire. And I will talk to everyone later. Bye.